I wanted to start with some really early works of mine. This is a building by Arata Isazaki in Japan, but the actual glass, all the stained glass in the skylight and the tower, and in the preceding image of a 19th century street in Leeds in England, are all made with mouth-blown glass and held together with a structural lead. And as the slides develop, this is the first building of Norman's that really grabbed my attention, Willis Faber Dumas building as it was called then, in Ipswich in England. And my first experience of it was as lit from inside as you see it now. And it was just shortly before Norman and I met. And this building quite genuinely changed my view of the world. Architecture at that time was generally speaking, particularly in England, median and dull, and represented a world really that had no excitement for me. And before I met Norman, I made this painting while I was still living in Derbyshire, before I even moved to London. And it's called Site Plan. And when I got back from seeing Norman's building in Ipswich, I was very young. I don't know how young, about 2, I think. I made this painting really not expecting later on to meet Norman, but just because it was in me and it had to get out. And it was bought by the City Museum in Sheffield, where it still is. And some years after that, Norman invited me to make a painting, or a tapestry as it turned out, inside that great building, the Willis Faber building. And of course the tapestry, as you see it there, is also born out of a series of appropriated references to the plan of Norman's building. And at that time, moving through a building through different layers by escalator rather than by elevators, it had a garden on a green area on the roof, and the whole building was open. You could interact with people. It was a very different experience than corporate headquarter buildings that I'd ever had before. And for me, it opened up. I was hungry as hell for architectural experience and for searching, and not really knowing what I was searching for, but searching for some way to connect and bind to, like a woven thing with a building. And as I say, and here, some years later, Norman's extraordinary, the corridor in Nîmes. And it's so, in those days, there was a lot of postmodern architecture around, and there was very much a stylistic war. But you can see here how context can really work. And Norman here has contextually blended the corridor, his building, with the classical Roman building without any, there's a difference between genuflection and sycophantism. And here at the Reichstag, you can see it. And it's an extraordinary thing, a gift that Norman has to actually create context without pastiche in order that a building can sit in its environment, be entirely and uncompromisingly contemporary, and yet somehow have a direct umbilical connection with what has happened before. And there are some years between the buildings we've seen, but one of the first things that I noticed at Willis Faber, and subsequently at other buildings, and here at the interior of the Reichstag, was the extraordinary manipulation of light. And it's true that when you go into Gothic cathedrals or classical buildings, and the movement of light, the way light navigates its way through a building can be very uplifting, but it doesn't have to be a religious building to have that experience. And I think that more than with anybody else, and here in Hong Kong, Shanghai Bank with the sun scoop and the light shooting back up through that central coilless building, there's a sense of secular grace that's afforded to anybody that experiences this. And I believe that you can have the same kind of inspirational, poetical drive, dynamic, triggered in your soul through these experiences without the building itself being religious. Here's that extraordinary bridge in France, and my wonderful brother, late brother, John, and I drove across this bridge. And I remember when Norman was working on it, him talking to me about the experience of flying when you drove on it. And I will never forget my wonderful and much missed brother, older brother John, as we drove across this bridge saying, "I love Norman. God, I love Norman. Isn't this one?" And he'd never been a pilot. He'd always wanted to pilot an aircraft. And when we drove across this bridge, he had that experience. But what I wanted to show those particular images for was to explain that when I, as an artist, or any artist working in architecture, begins the process, it's about context, and you've got to look at what the anchors are. And here, this extraordinary bridge, the context is the valley, the context is the landscape. And yet, somehow, without in any way damaging or interfering with this extraordinary valley, Norman makes it work. This is a funny old thing, because the reason I show you this is because this is one of the first things Norman and I did together, Stansted Airport. And the little blue squares you see across the back were originally going to be my stained glass contribution to the building. And the reason I show you this is that I think it must be the first time an artist ever got an opportunity to work on a computer, on a CAD machine. And Norman's office in those days, which was up in Fitzroy Street in London, I've got this machine that you could put, this computer that you could introduce elements into, like Photoshop. I don't know, it must be 30, 40 years ago. And this is one of the little watercolors of that. But we were so impressed by this thing, but the digital kind of, the lines are all pixelated, and it would be considered incredibly primitive today. But at the time when we did that, and it was actually introduced by the computer into Norman's building, it seemed to me like something from Star Trek. And here in Stansted Airport, which a little project Norman and I did together, it was just a kind of, it was a meeting area, like in Germany, a Treffpunkt in a transport hub. And this little tower was surrounded by some stained glass, backlit stained glass. This is just a mock-up of the tower so that we could see it. And it actually was removed by the British Airports Authority ultimately in order to make place for Casey Jones Burger Bar. So I don't know, we tried to find out what happened to these works, but they were stored in Sotheby's, then they were stored in some warehouse in Liverpool. I don't know what happened to them, but you can see that the skylights in the ceiling, I've kind of appropriated them and tried to make it fit in as much as possible, but I'm still using medieval technology, lead and glass, and which is entirely inappropriate to a building like Stansted Airport, but somehow we made it work, and Norman was brave enough or daft enough, I don't know which, to allow me to use that ancient technology in such a, I don't like the phrase, but in such a high-tech building. And it was a small introduction into a small moment in the building, because the bigger project earlier simply wasn't possible for a variety of practical reasons, I think. So this was one of the first things. And this is not with Norman, this is actually with a man who used to, with Future Systems, Jan Kapliski, who co-founded Future Systems with Amanda Levitt. This was a building 30 years ago that I did with Jan in Hamburg, the Ministry for the Environment. But again, it's a super appropriate technology building, but again, using glass and lead in the medieval way and trying to make it work. And as time went on, I had to find a new technology, a new way of that's a little detail of that, and had to find a way of making the medium more responsive to the moment. And as time went on, even though I still continue to love the medieval tradition of leaded mouth-blown glass, there are now other technologies that are more appropriate and more familial to the kind of architecture that Norman does. This is the King Faisal Foundation, Al-Faisaliyah, I think it's called, in Riyadh. And that's just one of the many sketches at the bottom, and how it fitted into the link building beneath the tapering tower in Riyadh. The figurative imagery I can say something about as we get going, because I have perhaps some interesting, I hope anyway, interesting comments to make about the use of figuration. And this is a snapshot that I think actually Norman took of me standing in front of an area of that window with the images of flora and fauna and natural life from the area in the Gulf. And this is where the break occurs from a medieval technology to a contemporary technology, and ceramic frick glazes were fired into the surface of float glass so that they sit in permanent, they become absolutely permanent and transparent, and it's made up of dots like a pointillist painting. And even though the imagery is clear and you see it, you can only really read the imagery the further back you get. Once you're close up to it, what you're more aware of is the falling kind of interacting layers. It's on 3 layers of the oscillating dots that you see. On the left there is an aerial view of a desalination plant or something, and on the right a close-up, as you can see, of all those transparent circles on different layers of, I think it's part of that panel of fish. In fact, I think the building you see through the image on the left, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's a Kenzo Tange building. Perhaps it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or something of the sort. I'm afraid my memory is not quite as good as it was. And this is another little project that I did with Norman but didn't actually happen in London, in Holborn. It was for Arthur Anderson, and the work was going to hang in the middle of that atrial space, and I never quite knew how to do it, how to kind of grasp it. And there was a period where I had a respiratory illness. I was in hospital in the London clinic, and the nurse was giving me oxygen, and I had the bed covered with paper and pencils, and I was trying to work out this idea for Norman's building, and the lady was putting the oxygen mask on me, and she said, "For goodness sake, draw in the air." And it answered all the questions, of course, because all I wanted to do was actually draw in that spatial experience, in that atrium. And it started a whole kind of line of experiments that I owe to that rather wonderful Jamaican nurse who castigated me and shouted at me to draw in the air. This is another project around the same period for the Point Village in Dublin, and I threw that in there simply because I love the idea of nocturnal stained glass, of stained glass that glows at night, either from outside of the building, as you see at the top, or as is artificially lit from inside at night, so the thing glows. And I'm really increasingly interested by how nocturnal stained glass can have an impact on the urban fabric. This is, I don't know if you can actually see on my screen, the actual apex of this pyramid in Kazakhstan, in Astana, the apex of that pyramid is stained glass. Again, it's the same idea. It's large areas of float glass with ceramic frit glazes fired into the surface. And it's a kind of whole flock of doves that I photographed in intense heat in Seville, where I lived some of the time in Spain. And the doves are pretty big. I think they're about 6 or 8 meters wingspan in this building. And of course, it would have been very easy to have done an entirely abstract work, an entirely non-objective composition. But this is one of Norman's earliest and I suppose kind of establishing buildings, the Sainsbury Center, which I loved when I saw it before it was finished. I loved it when I was a child, and I love it now. And on the left there, you've got a Tatlin's Tower there on the left that, of course, is just part of the sculpture garden. But one of the best things about Norman's buildings, particularly, is the way light plays. It plays through, and even though this is not an integral work of art for the building, I think it's one of my most joyous sort of moments as an artist, seeing this group of screens in the exhibition at the Sainsbury Center, and when the blinds lift up and the light comes in, watching how it plays across the exhibits and the engineering of the building, it kind of makes kind of life worth living for me, moments like that. And it's not often. This is a new project, entirely different technology that we've developed over the last years. This isn't really it. This is a computer thing, of the design. And the idea is, nature's always been a very important part of my thinking process in art. And I refer to nature continuously, and the further away from nature gets when I'm working, the closer it gets to a natural experience. This is actually in the same campus, University of East Anglia, that Norman's Sainsbury Center is in, and this is a project that we're doing at the moment, a faith centre, sort of well-being centre, and it's the first time we've actually designed the building as well, and I don't want any more comment on that particular issue, if you don't mind, but it's really the provision of a stage upon which stained glass can dance, and it creates this membranous filter of colour, but you can see through it from inside. But I really want it at night to have this kind of corpuscent, glowing experience, so that it will draw people, particularly now, after everything we've been through. This was started before COVID, and it was provoked by the number of suicides, young people, of students throughout the university world, not just in the UK, are occasioned as a result of the stress. And here, now these are 2 tiny, very recent windows that have just been being installed today, and they are splashes of paint that are based on poppies, I call them vespers, and it's etched on a series of layers and transparent, so that at first you're not quite sure whether there is a figurative meaning there or whether it's entirely abstract, non-figurative, but this is just a tiny little thing, and it's being installed today, so I thought it was appropriate to pop it in. And there we are back in Leeds, and I think we've done a full circle there. So you'll be much relieved now that Norman and Rob will be able to say something worthwhile instead of listening to me anymore.
No, Brian, that was very good. Thank you. I turn to Norman now, because it is rare among architects in my encounters, and even more rare historically, that an architect not only is open to these kinds of things, but actually seeks it out. And I wondered how you first, tumbled to what Brian was doing, what it was that you thought it could do with and for your architecture.
Brian, I remember going back, I think, to our first meeting. It was in your studio, and you introduced me not just to your art, but you talked about craft work. Do you remember?
Yeah.
There's a painting on the wall in where I'm, in this house, which was that painting from the 1970s.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It has these rhythmic crosses. It's the grid without a grid. The grid is defined by these crosses, and then the color moves across in an arbitrary way. And I remember you're talking about craft work and the kind of metronome, the regular beat, and then the oscillations that would disturb that regularity. And you related that. And I remember with my late wife, we loved the painting. We fell in love with the painting. We bought the painting, and that, in a way, that's how the collaboration started. I mean, so it was friendship, it was admiration and collaboration. And I, the great thing about you, Brian, is that you have this, architecture is in your bones. You understand it. You have a passion about it. And that, I think, is a powerful generator. I mean, we had a conversation when, very recently, and I was saying that, I need to work with engineers so that I understand the forces of gravity. Those things can be quantified, but the spirit, if you like, the forces of nature, gravity being one, wind being another, but in a way you capture the spirit of nature. And it's interesting that that is a word that recurs when you talk about your work. And that has the power to heighten the appreciation, the sense of space, the sense of light. It would be very difficult to imagine the Kazakhstan pyramid without that sunburst at the summit of the pyramid. But maybe back to back to our friend Rob.
Okay, well, I'll come back and say, one of the things that's striking about both of you is that you're very interested, not in technology as an image or in technology as a sort of a stylistic attribute, but in terms of what technologies can actually do to enhance other things. And I know that Sir Norman was very but very much excited by the work of Buckminster Fuller and by engineering as a factor in architecture. And you just used the word yourself not long ago. Brian also has been involved in innovations in stained glass technology, allowing him to do things without the leading and also sometimes with the leading that had never been done before. And I wonder if that relationship to technology as a friend and as a thing that can be always reconsidered is part of the bond between the two of you.
I think it's a means to an end, and to improve the quality of life. And I think the way in which Brian brings color and in a way heightens the sense of light. But there's also this, how can I say, the architectural device. You go up the ascending banks of escalators, almost like a kind of moving staircase to the sky. Brian provided the focal point in the same way that at Stansted, that column was like the classical obelisk in a city. It was a visual reference point from a distance. But I think one of the challenges in the point where Brian was describing the transition in his work to be able to use larger panels without the restrictions of the kind of lead mullions, that I sense, and I'd like to hear Brian's reaction, was perhaps the first time that he was confronted with the challenge of how you handle the figurative element in what would normally be a work of abstraction. And I remember talking to the owners of that building and seeking to persuade them to engage Brian and his power with stained glass to bring alive, to add another dimension to the base of their tower. And that, I remember coming back to Brian and saying, the good news, Brian, is I think I've got you a project in Saudi Arabia. It's the first tall building that's going to happen in Saudi Arabia. It's at the base. But the bad news is that they want images of camels, of flora, of fauna. And I thought, you know, how is Brian going to turn that into a memorable, and how do you avoid the kind of kitschy reproduction, the literal translation of that? And I think in a way, listening to Brian, when you're close up to that, it's a work of total abstraction. But when you have the perspective of distance, then it suddenly kind of snaps into focus. I'd love to hear you on that, Brian, because it's not something we've talked about much since.
I remember that that very well, the conversation about the camels. And I remember too being in Saudi Arabia a little later and us meeting, I think, the man who later went on to become King Abdullah, and him liking the design and asking me if I could change. There were figures of falcons, images of falcons in it, if we could change it so that they were his own personal falcons. And I remember with great kind of affection that period. But in fact, I think that there was a period, you know, that stained glass has always been essentially a figurative medium in its millennium of history. It's essentially been a figurative medium, and it was, as you know, as is often said, a biblia pauperum, the poor man's Bible, a way of illustrating figuratively narratives, biblical narrative. And then with the development of modernism and subsequently the post-war, the post-Second World War school of German abstractionism in stained glass, it became very much a non-objective and abstract medium, and I certainly embraced that with tremendous excitement and enthusiasm, almost a religious kind of puritanical enthusiasm. And then when this, and I think the first moment where I was, as it were, freed or liberated from the idea of calligraphic abstraction was, I think the camel was the liberating force. When I realized that if I make the comparison, believe me, in a modest way, but in rather the same way that Gerhard Richter has table hopped stylistically through his career in a way that is incredibly exciting and shamelessly engaging with anything that's there. And I think that an artist, there's such a huge reservoir of imagery and ideas to draw from as an artist, that whether it's figurative or whether it's abstract, whether it's drawn from inspiration from Wittgenstein or Karl Marx or Groucho Marx, it doesn't actually matter, so long as the architectural and contextual liaison is real and fixed, and that the experience that you create is concomitant with the idea of the architecture itself. And I'm perfectly comfortable designing a stained glass window that is entirely abstract, and equally comfortable if the need of the project requires, and I don't mean the client need or the brief, because very often, you know, and I'm not talking this specifically about this, but very often the client is the enemy. You know, you've really got to fight with a client to make it work. And I've had a number of occasions where clients have asked me to do abstract works similar or related to things that I did 20 or 30 years ago, and it's simply not appropriate. Equally, I've had a number of occasions, particularly recently, where I've been asked to do figurative things, and again, it's not appropriate. So you have to move and as it were, dance through these things. But basically, the world is an immense reservoir of exciting imagery. And as an artist who is kind of committed to architecture and thrilled by the conversation of architecture, you can dip. I feel it's entirely legitimate and entirely proper. Indeed, I would go so far as to say it's essential that you don't limit where, you know, it's a little bit like in the 80s, Norman was always described as a high-tech architect. And I've never seen that. I've always seen Norman as an architect who delivers appropriate technology, who delivers, I mean, look at the building in St. Moritz with the wooden pantiles, and it's about appropriate technology in the same way that poetry is about the appropriate use of imagery. You can't be a free poet and deliver a poetic idea, a musical idea, if you restrict yourself only to calligraphic abstraction or to colour. You particularly important if you're working in architecture. And I think that you know, the camel story actually takes me back to the moment where I was freed from a path I was navigating myself very enthusiastically, basically to be the last minimalist on the block. The camel moment was a very liberating moment for me, in which I really felt that I came of age as an artist, because I no longer had to follow any preordained idea about what serious art was. The whole world was open up to me through the agency of the Saudi camel.
This is a bit of a digression, but I remember attending a falcon auction in Abu Dhabi and being amazed at the beauty of the birds, the sums that were spent. And there is another motif, I guess, if you can have a falcon window of some kind in the Gulf, that could be quite spectacular.
There was a little bit of a joke going on there too, because in those days, I don't know if they do it so much now, but when you had a curtain wall glass building, they often used to put images of birds on them so that you knew that there was glass there. And so I rather enjoyed putting those birds across with such kind of carefully constructed and crafted ceramic glazes. Rather than just the kind of stuck on. It wasn't necessary to put them there, but there was a kind of jocular element involved in it, I must say. Yeah.
But there's a very interesting kind of underlying principle here, and that is that what was perceived to be the ultimate constraint in terms of artistic creativity ended up being totally liberating. Would you agree, Brian?
Absolutely, I absolutely would. Yeah, and it takes us on to the pyramid in Kazakhstan, in fact, because I remember when we were going round there with the clients, and they'd done a little bit of research, and they had some pictures of things I'd done before, and they were seeking out a kind of quite straightforward, almost a colour field explosion or something there. And when it became clear that that huge kind of meeting ring at the top of the apex was going to be used for conversations, well, the title of the building is the Pyramid of Peace and Reconciliation. So if there were conflicts going on, people would try to resolve those conflicts peacefully in that space. And I thought, I really can't engage in a self-indulgent abstraction here just in order to make an architectonic work that is polite and responsible in the context of the building. I want to actually influence the way these people think. And when doves fly against the sun. And I photographed all those doves myself in Seville in intense August heat. And the sun comes through the feathers and they become rather like leaves in a forest, like natural stained glass. So you see the light highlighting the structure, the internal engineering of the wing. And I loved what the sun did to that, and I wanted to somehow try and replicate that experience there and remind people of the nature of and the beauty of the physical world and the philosophical adjunct to it of that doves have historically represented, which is peace, which is being conciliatory, trying to reconcile issues through reason and goodwill in good faith. And I think I like to think that the people having those meetings there, in my kind of childlike juvenile fantasy, I like to imagine that I've prevented endless conflicts and wars.
But otherwise, I wonder if Norman could talk a little bit more about how modern architecture has been to a very large extent about glass. And much of what's been done with glass has been coating it with metallic elements and so on and so forth, but transparent glass that is coloristic, that is natural in its colors, that is again a great rarity. And some of the other things are beautiful, copper glass and so on are very beautiful, but they're of another order altogether. And when you think about buildings that you're about to build or have built, where in the process of your conception of them does this other kind of color enter in?
Well, I think the great thing about the collaboration and the projects that we've done together, Brian and I, is that it's not the kind of cosmetic application as a sort of afterthought. It's not the. I remember a conversation with Brian on a round table behind the glass wall of where we then were in Fitzroy Street. And we were bemoaning, we were criticizing the current tendency, which was that somehow you stuck a piece of art on the wall as part of a building, and it somehow, you got some brownie points for it. And I remember describing that as the lipstick on the gorilla. And I don't know whether you remember that, Brian, but...
Oh, I do. Yeah, I do. Yeah, and I think that sorry, Norman, we've...
I was going to say that what was generated between us was not a kind of afterthought. It wasn't a stick-on thing. It was something that emerged collaboratively, where we both dissolved the professional boundaries in the sense that we were open to consider a completely new way of looking at a glass wall where you didn't look through it, but it became light transmitting. And if you during the day, if you look at a glass wall from the outside, it's a black, opaque surface. Of course, at night, as we saw in the image of Willis Faber backlit, and here backlit on the image which is now on the screen, seeing the pinnacle of the Kazakhstan project, then that takes on a kind of magic quality. But I think that in that sense, we were both exploring, we were both pushing the boundaries. And so that is coming out of an attitude of mind where you have enough confidence in yourself and your collaborator, colleague, friend, however it is, to dissolve those boundaries. And the end result is better than the sum of the parts.
Could I ask a question which is partially technical and partially aesthetic, and they're both aesthetic, which is the ways in which you can laminate glass and essentially achieve color mixes that you could not achieve if you put just a color directly on a pane. I know that Elsa Kelly looked at this in terms of the project that he did in Houston at the in Austin at the Blanton, but where you basically have one piece of glass filter another piece of glass and create a color much as a painter would mix colors on a palette.
Yeah, I think Kelly's project was very successful in creating that kind of hovering sense of place. And it was made at the Maya studio in Munich when I was working there, and I watched the process a little bit, enjoyed it very much. But in terms of the technology that's changed now, at the moment, what it's possible to say and do through the medium of stained glass has immensely increased over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and now we can laminate layers of glass, and we've developed at the studio a system now for digitally etching glass and laminating it in layers so that you can create a foreground, a middle ground, and a distance in a single experience. And in fact, if I was readdressing those projects now, it would be done in a very different way. That was very much in the early stages of putting colour onto float glass. And you can also, and you can do this now with mouth-blown glass, which is the most extraordinary range of tone and colour. The traditional medieval way of blowing glass limits the size of the piece of glass to the amount of weight a glassblower can lift on his tube and blow, and it's usually about 80 by 60. But now, through the lamination, the extraordinary advances in lamination, those sheets can be put onto great sheets of float glass, and you can do the entire side of a building. I remember having a very amusing conversation with David Sylvester and Philip Johnson in New York some years ago, in which I kind of got rather carried away about my description of what I want, how I saw my life going. And I really did believe that by the time I was my age now, you would be able to drive down Fifth Avenue or Madison Avenue at night and everything would be glowing and luminous, and the nighttime experience of Manhattan would have been as brilliant and as extraordinary as the daytime experience of being in Santa Vitale in Venice with the mosaics or something. And it has. So the technology has changed, and even though it's an odd thing, I mean, Norman's probably not even aware of it, but Norman has in many ways been responsible for the development of this 1,000-year-old medium into a different expression through our various engagements. And there was there's this idea that I think there is a religious aspect to stained glass, but it's not conventional religious experience. It's not about the kind of Methodist God who's got suburban taste. It's about somehow touching the human soul through very natural way of the passage of light through a membrane of colour. And you remember that historically the Annunciation is often, and the Immaculate Conception, it's often portrayed in historical art as a light passing through, yet leaving the filter through which it passes and makes it coloured, leaving it immaculate and clean and extraordinary. And I still live for those moments. When I go to bed at night, I lie on my back and with eyes closed, but I look on the ceiling like it's a drawing board and imagine all kinds of buildings, whether they're Gothic cathedrals or Romanesque churches or 1960s bus stations or railroad stations, and I imagine how they can be altered and transmogrified, as it were, from something base into something spiritual. The idea that we have the potential for the urban fabric to be an experience that really does make one feel like, you know, we're always seeking as artists and as people for our souls, if you like, our core, to be freed from matter. And somehow, because it's not reliant upon reflected light, but upon transmitted light, the analogy of the divine, it's an inevitable one with stained glass, but the divine, as we said earlier, it doesn't have to be in a religious building. It can be in a truck stop. It can be in a bus station. It can be anywhere. And I see no reason why the general public, at their immense largeness, should not be able to engage in that kind of experience either by day or nocturnally.
Well, hold on to that utopian vision and know that someday a very large black and gold building that's on the corner of 57th and 5th may come down, and that will leave a location.
Well, I hope when it comes down, the owner is in it.
I hope so too, but then Norman and you can build a lantern on the corner of 5th and 57th Street, and all will be well, and the city will be purified.
I'm with you there. I'm with you there.
Good. I think we've done our time pretty much, have we not?
We haven't.
What?
Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. This has been such an extraordinary conversation.
It was, Norman and I used to meet often a very, very long time ago in a little Greek restaurant in Paddington owned by a man called Stelios. And we had conversations like this over and over again over extremely good Greek food. And I look forward post-COVID to another such experience with you too, Rob, I hope.
Well, I like Greek food very much, so let's do that. Well, I would just like to thank both Norman and Brian for what they have done and for the spirit in which they've done it. And we can only hope that there will be further collaborations, including the one for which I might claim some kind of authorship.
Great. It's been great to talk to you all, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's very kind of you to join us. It's been great to talk to Norman and Rob together, and thank you to the museum for setting all this up, and to HENI for the continued help and support in all the arts that they touch. Thank you.